Have you ever, like, been totally convinced by those glowing online reviews only to be a little let down when you actually try the thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Or maybe you spend hours wrestling with some new software thinking, like, I'll get this eventually, even though it's driving you crazy.
Yeah,
It seems like everyone has these moments where, our thinking goes a little off track.
it does.
And it turns out these might not just be random brain farts.
Right.
They're often, well, predictable patterns. What some people call cognitive errors, I think.
That's right, yeah. What can feel like, a personal blind spot is often a well-documented thing in psychology.
Okay.
These cognitive errors, which Rolf Dobelli explores in his book, The Art of Thinking Clearly, they're essentially like systematic ways we deviate from rational thought.
Interesting. So, like, these aren't just flukes. They're actually kind of, like, built in.
Exactly.
Huh.
And recognizing them is kind of the first step to making, better decisions, especially when we're trying to quickly wrap our heads around new information, which, is kind of what we're all about.
Right. And that's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into some of these mental traps, specifically for you, the listener, who wants to cut through the noise, figure out what's important, and, not get bogged down by information overload.
Yeah.
Think of this as like your cheat sheet to understanding, well, why we think the way we do and how to do it maybe just a little bit better. Dobelli pulls examples from all over the place, business, personal decisions, even history. And we've picked out the ones that, that we thought would give you those like aha moments,
Absolutely. The ones that really help you understand your own thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, as we get into these examples from Dobelli's book, you might notice that some of them touch on, well, some sensitive topics. Like, for instance, he uses a historical speech by Goebbels to illustrate the power of social proof.
Oh, right.
And when we discuss these kinds of examples, it's super important to remember that we're really just focused on understanding the cognitive error itself.
Right. Not endorsing or taking sides or anything like that.
Exactly. We're examining the content of the source to dissect how these thinking errors actually work.
Gotcha.
Not to endorse any of the viewpoints that are expressed in the original material.
Makes sense.
It's really about understanding these psychological mechanisms in action.
Okay, cool. So with that said, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
The first one that really made me stop and think is survivorship bias. What's the basic idea there?
So at its core, survivorship bias is our tendency to focus on the successes in a particular field or situation while kind of overlooking the failures.
Right.
And this skewed perspective can lead us to think that success is a lot easier to achieve than it really is.
I think.
And interestingly, this bias can even affect how we remember history. We often focus on the winners, and kind of overlook the contributions or perspectives of those who didn't survive in a particular field or conflict.
Yeah, like we only hear about the people who made it big, not all the ones who tried and didn't.
Exactly. And Dobelli uses this example of aspiring entrepreneurs, right? They read about these incredibly successful startups and think, oh, that could be me.
I'm going to be the next Steve Jobs.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't see the vast majority of startups that just, fizzle out and disappear completely.
Right. It's like looking at a graveyard, but only seeing the really fancy headstones, the people who live to be like 100.
That's a great analogy. And for every best-selling author celebrated in the media, there are countless others whose manuscripts never get published.
Wow.
And then beyond them, there are even more who dream of writing but never even finish a book. The media, they naturally focus on those visible successes, which, it makes sense. It's not really their job to highlight the failures.
Right.
So we need to be more conscious about broadening our perspective.
Okay, so we need to actively seek out the other side of the story.
Exactly, to get a more accurate picture.
And it's not just about career paths, is it? There's that thing Dobelli calls the swimmer's body illusion.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I thought that was really insightful.
What's fascinating about that is that it plays on this confusion between selection factors, meaning the traits someone already has that make them good at something like swimming, and the results, what we see.
Right.
We see these amazing swimmers with incredible physiques, and we think, oh, swimming must be what gives you that body.
I'm going to join the swim team and get ripped.
Right. But it's way more likely that the people who are naturally built for swimming, with long limbs, certain muscle structure, they're the ones who are drawn to it and then excel and really dedicate themselves to the sport.
So it's not the swimming that's causing it, it's the pre-existing physical traits.
Exactly. And Dobelli even argues that without recognizing this illusion, a lot of advertising wouldn't work.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. We're constantly bombarded with images of, the perfect body, the luxurious lifestyle, but we don't see the initial advantages or the super intense selection processes that led to those outcomes.
So we're like comparing ourselves to the finished product, not the raw materials.
Precisely.
Huh. And he even uses prestigious universities like Harvard as an example.
Oh, yeah.
We often assume that a degree from a place like that automatically means success.
Right, because we see all these successful people who went to Harvard. So it's easy to conclude that, Harvard must provide an amazing education.
Right.
But Dobelli makes us think, what if the university itself is actually pretty average? What if it's just that they're incredibly selective about who they admit, They're choosing the brightest, most driven students from the start.
Right. So the success might not be because of Harvard, but because of the type of people who get into Harvard.
Exactly. And he talks about his own experience at the University of St. Gallen, which is, considered a top business school.
Okay.
And he found the teaching methods to be, honestly, pretty ordinary.
Huh.
He suggests that the success of the graduates might actually be more because of the kind of students they admit, rather than the curriculum itself.
Interesting. So it's like the school is getting credit for the students' pre-existing abilities.
Exactly.
Wow. So for our listeners out there who are trying to figure out what really leads to success in, whatever field they're interested in, the key takeaway here is don't just look at the highlight reel.
Right.
Consider how many people actually succeed, how many fail, which we often don't see, and whether what you're observing is the cause of success or just, a correlation because of some pre-existing advantage.
It's like Dobelli says, you got to take a hard, honest look in the mirror.
Yeah, that's good advice.
So building on this idea that, we can be misled by incomplete information, like with survivorship bias, let's talk about another way our brains can trick us. The clustering illusion.
Okay.
This is where we see patterns that aren't really there.
Ah, like when you stare at the clouds and see a dragon or a face, right?
Exactly. And Dobelli actually uses a pretty unusual example with this Swedish opera singer and these supposed supernatural messages in his recordings.
Okay, this sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is. What's so captivating about Friedrich Jorgensen's story is how he interpreted random noise as some kind of meaningful communication. He bought a tape player, and he started to hear what he thought were these supernatural whispers.
Oh,
Then
wow.
he recorded birdsong and became convinced he could hear his deceased mother's voice in it.
Wow, that's pretty out there.
It is, but it's a powerful illustration of this very human need to find order and meaning, even in random data.
Like we're hardwired to see patterns,
Exactly.
even when they're not actually there.
And it's kind of like when you're watching a basketball game and a player makes 3 baskets in a row and the commentators start talking about their hot hand.
Oh, yeah, they're on fire.
Right. Like they've tapped into some magical streak of luck. But, statistical analysis often shows that there's no such thing as a predictable streak of luck.
So it's just random chance, but we see it as a pattern.
Exactly. Our brains evolved to detect patterns. That was, probably super important for survival back in the day.
Right, like noticing the tracks of a predator or something.
Right. But this tendency can also mislead us when we start attributing meaning to just random events.
I see.
Dobelli talks about the research that debunks the hot hand in sports, showing that what we perceive as, streaks of skill are often just statistical noise.
Oh, that's interesting. So the hot hand is like a myth.
Pretty much. So, when you're looking at data or observing events, be careful about jumping to conclusions about patterns without solid evidence.
Okay, so the takeaway here, when you're trying to make sense of information quickly, is to be wary of seeing patterns where none really exist.
Right.
Just because a few things seem to line up doesn't automatically mean there's a real connection.
Exactly. Don't jump to conclusions.
All right. Let's
Yeah.
move on to a cognitive error that I think really affects how we, interact with other people and the information they give us.
Okay.
Social proof. This is something we see all the time when we're trying to figure out, what's believable or reliable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Social proof is huge.
It's like the safety in numbers thing, right? If a
Yeah.
lot of people believe something, we're more likely to believe it too.
Exactly. It's our tendency to look to the behavior and beliefs of others, especially when we're not sure how to think or act in a certain situation.
Right, like we're looking for cues from other people.
And Dobelli talks about how it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Okay.
In the past, mimicking the group's behavior often meant survival.
Oh, right. If everyone's running away, you probably should too.
Exactly. No time to ask questions.
Makes sense. He uses the example of choosing a restaurant in a city you've never been to before.
Yeah, that's a classic one.
If one restaurant is packed and the one next door is empty,
Mhm.
you're probably going to go for the crowded one, right?
Right. You assume that crowd knows something you don't.
Exactly.
It's like a built-in shortcut for making decisions.
Right.
And he also talks about the use of canned laughter in comedy shows.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Like, even if a joke isn't that funny, if you hear other people laughing, you're more likely to laugh too.
Exactly. It primes you to find it funnier.
Huh. That's interesting.
And then he brings up a really powerful and kind of disturbing example, Joseph Goebbels' speech in 1943, where he basically rallied this massive crowd to support total war.
Oh, right.
It shows the darker side of social proof.
Definitely.
How it can not only influence, small choices like picking a restaurant, but also override critical thinking and even moral compasses.
Goebbels, even as the war was, clearly turning against Germany, he asked this huge crowd if they wanted total radical war.
Oh, wow.
And the fact that he got this overwhelming unified roar of approval, it shows how the collective can really sway individual judgment, even towards extreme and potentially disastrous outcomes.
Right. Outcomes that those same individuals might not agree with if they were asked privately.
Exactly. It highlights the danger of just blindly following the crowd, especially when that crowd's being manipulated.
So for you, the listener, when you're bombarded with information or opinions, remember that social proof is a powerful force. Be aware of how the sheer number of people endorsing something can affect your own views, and take the time to critically evaluate the information yourself, rather than just going with the flow.
Absolutely. Don't just assume the crowd is always right.
Okay, good advice. Let's talk about another cognitive bias that can really mess with our ability to make rational decisions, especially when we're trying to learn from our past experiences.
Okay.
The sunk cost fallacy. Ah, yes. That's a tricky one.
This is where we keep investing in something just because of how much we've already put into it, even if it's clearly not working out.
Exactly. It's that feeling of being in too deep to quit.
Right.
And the fallacy is that we let those past investments, whether it's time, money, effort, emotional energy, whatever, dictate our future actions, even when it's not logical anymore.
I see. Like, we're throwing good money after bad, so to speak.
Exactly. Dobelli has this great example of an advertising campaign that had been running for months with zero positive results. But the manager insisted on continuing it just because they had already spent so much money on it.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that happening. It's like when you spent hours trying to fix something that's broken.
Yeah.
And you just keep going because you don't want all that effort to be wasted.
Right, even though it might be more efficient to just start over.
Yeah.
And he also shares this story about a friend who stayed in a really unhappy relationship for years despite being constantly mistreated by his partner.
Oh.
And his reason. He felt like he had already invested so much energy into the relationship that it would be a waste to leave.
Oh, that's sad.
It is. And this fallacy is especially dangerous in financial decisions.
Right, like investors holding on to losing stocks just because they bought them at a higher price?
Exactly. They get fixated on that initial price and ignore the current reality of the market. The key to overcoming this, though, is to realize that those past investments are gone. They're gone, regardless of what you decide to do next.
So, don't dwell on the past, focus on the future.
Exactly. Focus on what could happen, not on what you've already spent.
So for those listening, when you're deciding whether to stick with something, whether it's a project, something you're learning, even a relationship, try to detach yourself from those past investments and look objectively at the potential for the future.
Yeah.
Don't let what you've already sunk in cloud your judgment.
Good advice. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the principle of reciprocity. This is a deeply ingrained social norm that can really influence our decisions, especially when we're interacting with people who might have, their own agendas.
Oh, yeah, I know you mean. It's like if someone does something nice for you, you feel like you have to do something nice for them in return.
Exactly. It's that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And Dobelli uses this example of a screw supplier and a potential customer at a sporting event.
The screw supplier. Okay.
Yeah, so the supplier invites this potential customer to a, fun sporting event. Seems like a nice gesture, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But what's interesting is how that seemingly generous act can create this unspoken sense of obligation.
I see.
So when it comes time for the customer to actually buy screws, they might feel this subconscious pressure to choose that supplier, even if another supplier offers a better price or product.
Oh, so it's like a subtle way of influencing their decision.
Exactly. And it shows how even small gestures can trigger this powerful urge to repay what we perceive as a debt.
Interesting. So it's almost like a hidden social transaction.
Right. And Dobelli talks about how it has evolutionary roots. Back in early human societies, sharing resources was crucial for survival.
Oh, right.
If you shared your food with someone when you had plenty, they were more likely to share with you when you were struggling.
Makes sense.
So this deeply ingrained tendency to reciprocate, it's a fundamental part of being human.
So the takeaway here, especially for those in business or sales, is to be aware of this natural inclination to reciprocate. Recognize when someone is doing something for you and ask yourself if it might be creating an unconscious bias in your decision-making.
Exactly. Be mindful of those strings attached.
Good advice. Okay, let's talk about another cognitive bias that really shapes how we interpret new information.
Okay.
Confirmation bias. I think this one's particularly relevant when we're trying to learn about something new and form our own understanding.
Oh, absolutely. Confirmation bias is everywhere.
It's like we tend to look for and favor information that already agrees with what we believe and ignore or downplay anything that contradicts it.
That's it in a nutshell.
Dobelli quotes Aldous Huxley saying, "Facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored."
That's a great quote.
Right. And I think it really captures the essence of this bias.
It does. It's like we can choose to ignore facts, but that doesn't make them any less true.
Right.
And, Warren Buffett famously said, what the human being is best at doing is interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusions remain intact.
Oh, that's good. So we're basically masters at twisting information to fit our existing beliefs.
Yeah, we're very good at that. And, it's a major obstacle to learning and thinking critically.
Dobelli gives this common business scenario where an executive team comes up with a new strategy, and then they only focus on the data that supports its success while overlooking anything that suggests it might be failing.
Oh, yeah. Classic confirmation bias. They're selectively paying attention to the information that confirms their initial decision.
And dismissing the contradictory data as just a fluke or, an exception.
Exactly. And Dobelli talks about how Charles Darwin had this remarkable approach to fighting this bias.
Oh, interesting. What did he do?
He actually made a point of seeking out and meticulously recording any evidence that contradicted his own theories.
Wow. So he was actively trying to prove himself wrong.
He was. Because he knew that our natural inclination is to just forget or dismiss those inconvenient truths.
That's pretty impressive.
It is. So for you, the listener, when you're trying to learn something new or evaluate different perspectives, the key takeaway here is actively seek out information that challenges your current understanding.
Okay.
Be especially skeptical when you find yourself easily accepting information that supports your views and automatically dismissing anything that doesn't fit.
Right. Don't just live in an echo chamber.
And pay close attention when you hear the word exception being used. That might be a sign that contradictory evidence is being swept under the rug.
Good point. Okay, let's move on to another interesting cognitive effect.
All right.
The contrast effect. This one plays on how our perception of something can be totally swayed by what we compare it to.
Oh, yeah, the good old relative value trick.
Right. Dobelli tells this funny story about a clothing store run by these two brothers, Sid and Harry.
Ah, yes, Sid and Harry. It's a classic example of how easily our judgment can be manipulated through comparison.
So tell us about it.
Well, Sid, the salesman, would pretend to misunderstand Harry's inflated price for a suit and then quote a much lower price to the customer.
Okay.
And because the customer had just heard that ridiculously high price, they'd jump at the discounted price, feeling like they were getting an amazing deal.
Even if the lower price was still pretty high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That initial extreme price created a contrast that made the second offer seem much more appealing.
Oh, that's clever. It's like a psychological trick.
It is. And it's the same principle behind all those discount marketing tactics.
Oh, right. Like a product marked down from $50 to $30 feels like a better deal than the same product just priced at $30 from the start.
Exactly. And Dobelli also points out how this affects investors. They might see a stock that has dropped significantly from its peak price and think it's a great value, even if its fundamentals don't really justify that assessment.
Oh, yeah.
It's that contrast with the previous high price creating an illusion of value.
So we're not looking at the actual value. We're just comparing it to what it used to be.
Exactly. And he relates this to more gradual changes, too.
Yeah.
Like, think about gaining weight slowly. We might not notice a small increase day by day, but over time, the cumulative effect can be significant.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And similarly, the gradual erosion of our purchasing power due to inflation, it's less noticeable than a sudden price hike.
So the key takeaway here is to be aware that our judgments are often relative, not absolute. When you're evaluating something, try to assess its inherent worth, not just compare it to something else, especially if that something else has been deliberately presented to create a contrast.
Exactly. Don't be fooled by those tricky comparisons.
Okay, let's move on to another bias that can really affect our judgment, especially when we're assessing risks and probabilities.
Right.
Availability bias.
Oh, yeah. Availability bias. That's a big one.
This is about how easily something comes to mind,
Yeah.
right? And how that can influence how likely we think it is to happen.
Exactly. And, those dramatic events that get a lot of media attention, like plane crashes, are perfect examples.
Oh, yeah?
Because they're so vivid and emotionally charged, and because we see them plastered all over the news, they're easily recalled.
Right.
And that vividness can lead us to overestimate how often they actually happen and our own personal risk of experiencing them.
So, we think we're more likely to die in a plane crash than, in a car accident.
Exactly. Even though statistically, driving is much more dangerous.
Right, but it's those vivid images of plane crashes that stick in our mind.
Exactly. It's the availability of those images that skews our perception.
And on the flip side, less dramatic but more common risks like diabetes or heart disease, we tend to underestimate those.
Right, because they don't get the same sensationalized coverage. Our brains tend to give more weight to the information that's easily available, even if it's not statistically representative.
So the message here is to remember that what pops into your head most easily isn't always the most accurate reflection of reality, especially when you're trying to figure out risks or make decisions based on probabilities.
Don't let the vividness of an event distort your judgment.
Okay, good advice. Let's wrap up with one last cognitive fallacy that can lead us to, stick with strategies that aren't working or are even harmful.
Okay, sounds interesting.
The it'll get worse before it gets better fallacy.
Yes, the false hope of a light at the end of the tunnel.
This is the belief that things have to get worse before they can get better, right?
Exactly. It's like clinging to the idea that a period of difficulty is a necessary step towards eventual success.
Dobelli shares a pretty concerning personal experience with this.
He does. He talks about trusting a doctor who diagnosed his abdominal pain and told him it would get worse before it got better.
Oh, no.
And because Dobelli believed that prediction, he delayed seeking a second opinion.
Whoa.
And it turned out he had appendicitis, which needs immediate treatment. That delay could have been really bad for him.
That's scary.
It is. And it shows how this fallacy can lead to some serious problems.
It's a reminder to really question those predictions, especially when there's no clear reason why things should have to decline before they improve.
Right. Sometimes a worsening situation just means you're on the wrong track and need to change course.
So be very skeptical of anyone who tells you it's going to get worse before it gets better, especially if they can't give you a good explanation for why.
Absolutely. Don't suffer needlessly.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive into how our minds work. Just being aware of these cognitive errors feels like, like having a new set of glasses to see the world through.
It really is. Recognizing these systematic patterns of flawed thinking is the foundation for clearer, more rational thought, which leads to better decision-making.
Right.
And it's important to remember that these biases, they're not, signs of weakness or stupidity. They're human tendencies that affect everyone, no matter how smart or experienced you are.
That's reassuring.
And for you, our listener, understanding these cognitive errors is like a superpower for processing information better, avoiding common traps in judgment, and gaining knowledge more thoroughly and efficiently.
It's about understanding how our minds work, so we can navigate the world of information with more clarity and confidence.
Absolutely. And we encourage you to think back on your own experiences and see if you can spot instances where these biases might have influenced your thinking.
Yeah, that's a good exercise.
And if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking Clearly, and the work of cognitive psychologists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
And to leave you with a final thought, consider how the sheer volume and speed of information in our modern world might be amplifying these cognitive errors.
That's an interesting point.
What proactive steps can you take in your everyday life to counteract these ingrained tendencies and make more rational and informed judgments?
It's something to think about.
Definitely. Until next time.
See you then.